Hello, everybody. Welcome. We'll wait a few minutes until the top of the hour to start. Tom. Tom, I think I just approved you to share your audio and video.
There we go.
There it is. So that was a little interesting when you were speaking in the keynote and started responding in the chat.
Yeah. The keynote is the only pre-recorded session that we've got. We had the same comedy last year.
Funny.
I just can't help myself.
Well, and it makes sense to pre-record the keynotes because everyone's going to be stressing out about their breakout sessions.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes it a lot easier, and especially from mine and Pranima's perspective. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, Pranima, of course, is extremely busy, and I mean, if I'm honest, I was up fairly late last night finishing up my last presentations.
Good times. Good times. I know the folks that are in the demo jam have been putting some effort into those. The demo jam is going to be awesome. It's going to be really, really good.
I'm really excited for the demo jam, and that's tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of we cap off everything with the demo jam.
Yep.
It's going to
All
be a lot
right.
of fun.
Just another minute, folks, and we'll go ahead and let Tom get rolling. One of the logistically, I think what we'll do is we'll save questions to the end. So if you want to throw questions into the Q&A section, we can have them queued up there so that Tom can review and answer those at the end of his presentation. But for this particular session, it feels like it'll be the better path to go ahead and let him get through his presentation and then address the Q&A at the end. And here we are at the top of the hour. So welcome, everybody. Want to introduce Tom Hatch, which we all just met in the keynote speeches. This session is called Open Source in the Enterprise. So take it away, Tom, and I'll mute and shut off my camera.
Jeff, thanks for the introduction. I'll actually reintroduce Jeff. And just want to give a shout out to Jeff Blair. He's been with Salt. How long have you been with us?
Coming up on 4 years in March.
I was about to say I thought it was getting close to 4 years.
Yeah.
Jeff's been a really good friend of mine and has done an absolutely fantastic job in helping manage bringing a lot of salt products to market, and just a fantastic guy to work with. So just want to say thanks to Jeff before we get started.
Thank you.
All right. The beard. Sorry, I saw a comment. Somebody commenting on how they like your beard, Jeff. It is a fantastic beard. I'll have to grow a beard eventually. All right. This session is about open source in the enterprise. Now, one of the things that we've got to keep in mind when we look at, or one of the things I want to talk about looking at open source in the enterprise, is that this is a lot more complicated than I think that it was a decade ago. So many things have changed in the entire tech landscape over the last 10, 20 years. And open source has been a massive force to make that change happen. And I want to talk about what the impacts are for open source in the enterprise, what open source monetization means, what are some of the liabilities of open source. But I also want to bring a strong emphasis on how I feel that open source has fundamentally changed every aspect of the entire tech landscape and what that means for the future of tech, the future of software development in general, the future of product development, and how the economy of software needs to adjust as it keeps moving forward. So open source has deeply and fundamentally changed the way the entire world works. Open source software is now at the core at virtually all modern technology. You cannot produce modern technology without a strong reliance on open source software. It is the element which makes it possible for us to create advanced and powerful software stacks. It doesn't matter if a company is a fundamentally proprietary company or a fundamentally open source company. You must have an open source strategy to be able to run in the modern technology world. The last 20 years have seen an explosion in open source. And I don't want to just talk about the last 20 years, but also very much I want to focus on the last 10 to 12 years. Because when we go back and we look at what happened in 2008, up until that point, open source software was used, but it had not yet become as universal as it is now. Open source software was being poked around and played with by a lot of companies, but it had not yet become a completely universal underpinning to virtually all technology. And the Great Recession, I feel, significantly big. That was one of the significant catalysts for open source historically, because all of a sudden we had all of these companies come back and say, we've got to save money. We have to rethink. When these big shifts happen, like the Great Recession, like the pandemic, it forces us to rethink how we approach markets, how we approach our day-to-day, how we approach problem solving. And so we saw a dramatic upshift in open source utilization, but also open source investment. All of a sudden you had large numbers of companies that were receiving sizable amounts of venture capital to explore open source options. And many of these companies had no idea how they were going to monetize, how they were going to go to market, how they were going to deliver their open source solution on a larger scale. And this explosion has also exposed something that we generally don't like to talk about in open source, that I'm going to be a little more bold about today, and that is the liabilities that come with open source software. We must be aware that just because something is free, it doesn't mean that it doesn't come with liabilities. Many of you are probably familiar with the old phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody has to pick up the bill. And we need to understand where those bills are to be able to successfully navigate the new world of open source. Now, open source software fundamentally changes the playing field that we are all working in. When we come back and we look at what's happened with the overall software ecosystem, what happens with open source is that all of a sudden, everyone in the software economy, everybody who's building software, every developer, every startup, every large corporation, every small corporation, suddenly has access to an extremely large foundation of extremely powerful tools. And these powerful tools mean that we have to begin to rethink the strategy that we have to take, not just from an open source perspective, but also from a proprietary perspective. All software that's being built now needs to take into account what a broader open source strategy needs to look like. We cannot affect long-term business and development and technical strategy without accounting for what's happening inside of the open source ecosystem. In my keynote that many of you just listened to, I was able to talk a little bit about the Wrath of Khan and Star Trek and the strategy that is taken by Kirk. I almost said Picard, that would have been embarrassing. But the strategy taken by Kirk and how he was able to look at things from a three-dimensional perspective. Open source mandates that we look at things from a three-dimensional perspective. Also, the overall complexity of the technology ecosystem as it exists today also means that even making short-term tactical decisions means that we have to have a strong understanding of a larger ecosystem and what our long-term strategic decisions look like. In a book that one of my favorite books called The Book of Five Rings, which was written by a samurai hundreds of years ago, he talks about how nobody seems to understand strategy. And so I'll give a brief overview of what strategy is. Strategy means that you're able to understand what your long-term objectives are. The right way to make short-term decisions or tactical decisions are all about first understanding your long-term goals, what those long-term goals are, how you want to get to those long-term goals. And then you make short-term tactical decisions that allow you to win immediate battles and immediate challenges right in front of you, but that also direct you towards a long-term strategic goal. We must understand the ecosystem which is given to us by open source, how to operate inside of that ecosystem, and how to marry our own development strategies with that long-term open source ecosystem to be able to successfully get to where we want to be from a long-term development perspective. And that means that we have to not only understand the strengths and the flows and how open source is managed, but we also need to understand the liabilities that come with open source software. And so I want to start with an age-old question, it seems, in open source. We have to first understand how you monetize open source. And I'm going to talk about monetizing open source in a broader sense. Generally speaking, when we think about monetizing open source, especially if we go back a few years, there were many different strategies that everyone always talked about. But I want to be very clear. There is one strategy that permeates all of the different ways in which people win with open source and ways in which they monetize open source and drive revenue with open source. And that is that they have to win twice. We see many examples of this, but I feel strongly that we need to formalize what this overall strategy looks like. And that's what I'm going to be spending a bulk of this presentation talking about. What it means to win twice means that from an open source perspective, you have to be able to develop, maintain, and push software in the community and open source ecosystem. But that software needs to create gravity towards completely separate proprietary software or completely separate deliverables which don't make sense or don't get developed in a completely open way, in a smooth and clean manner. And there's a lot of software that's evolved this way. One of my favorite things that I heard Linus Torvalds say years ago was that he no longer tries to get his family members to use a Linux desktop. He says that's not necessarily what they're looking for. And he understood, and a lot of people have understood, that what we are actually delivering to the end consumer is different from what the original goals and aspirations of the open source movement were. Those original goals in the open source movement were in a very large part to be able to say we want to infect the world with open source software. We want everything to be open source. Unfortunately, this mentality, I'm going to argue, was naive because the economics don't work. We still need to be able to have motivation to develop. And that motivation to develop changes depending on what we are making, the purpose of that thing that we're making, and why we're making it. And so we have to begin to understand that monetizing open source is all about winning twice. And when I say monetizing open source is about winning twice, we're beginning to see this from a proprietary software development as well. When proprietary software is developed, you also need to win twice. It's becoming increasingly difficult to create successful proprietary software platforms without strong driving open source elements that create gravity towards those proprietary platforms that are built to solve specific and different needs. So I wanted to talk about a concept that I've been working on that I'm calling the Trinity of open source. Back during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, there was a brilliant Prussian general by the name of Karl von Clausewitz. Karl von Clausewitz wrote a book called The Theory of War, which is a very difficult read, but extremely insightful. And this book was used as really a backbone to teach people the strategy of war for many years. And Clausewitz recognized something that I feel has happened to the tech landscape over the last 10 years. Clausewitz recognized that what Napoleon did in France fundamentally changed the nature of armed conflict. And he did that, Napoleon did that by arming the entirety of the nation, by arming all of France to go to war during the Napoleonic era. And Clausewitz created something that he called the Trinity of War, which stated that to be able to wage war, you needed to have the political and government objectives as one component of the triangle. You need to have the power of the military as another component, and you need to have the will of the people as the third component. I feel very strongly that the long-term view of how to craft a tech product strategy will mandate that we have what I'm calling right now the Trinity of open source. But we could very much call it the Trinity of development or software engineering. You must have a master objective. That objective needs to be what is tying things together from an overall political, strategic perspective. And then you need to know how to draw in a community and what that community is and what it means. Because having a community work on your software creates a gravity that you just can't go to market with anymore. And I feel that that's going to be an increasingly apparent issue as the world moves forward. But then we also need to understand what a customer deliverable is. What are the differences between that which is delivered to a community and that which is delivered to a customer? We need to understand that these are distinctly separate entities that need to be addressed, as opposed to the way that we often look at product development, which is primarily around saying, here's a user, they have needs, here's how we're going to fulfill those needs. Instead, I think that we need to understand that we have a large ecosystem of software users, and we have to create incredibly complicated and powerful software platforms. And that if we're going to be able to create those platforms that deliver the end product to a customer, we need to understand what all of the pylons are, all of the structural components that are needed to get there. And we need to understand that it's becoming increasingly impossible. and just not tangible for an organization or a team or a company or a corporation, regardless of size, to address those high-level customer needs without creating community and open source products. And so let's drill in a little bit on the three corners of the Trinity of open source. First, we have the objective. The objective must encompass the needs of everyone involved. It needs to encompass the needs of the community. It needs to encompass the needs of the consumer. It needs to be able to understand what that large scale vision is. When we define the ultimate goal and what we want to do to drive that goal, I got to be honest, it can still be a little nebulous. That's what strategy oftentimes is. When you look into the future and plan the future and try and discern how you're going to get to a certain location in the long run, you need to understand and accept that getting to that location in the long run is a nebulous act and a nebulous path. There are going to be things that happen in the future that you're not ready for. And so driving strategy means that you make short-term decisions that drive towards the strategy, but keeps doors open. And so defining this long-term objective can be quite difficult. Sticking to it can be difficult because you have to both drive towards that objective and be willing to make flexible changes as the world around you moves and shifts. So the first thing is understanding that objective, understanding that it does not have to be perfectly defined, but also understanding that where you want to get to is critical to building your overall view and your overall strategy. And that having that political will, that strategic will, is so very important to the overall goals that you're trying to achieve. Next, let's dive into the community. If I go back 15, 20 years and look at what open source community meant, the philosophy of the open source community was very much so that open source software will one day rule the world. We waited and worked towards the year of the open source desktop. We anticipated that someday everybody would be running GNOME or KDE. Everyone would run a Linux desktop. I'm going to have to say my feelings on this is that unfortunately that didn't happen. But at the same time, it kind of did. A large percentage of the systems that are out there today are running Android, which is based on the Linux kernel. But that platform emphasizes the criticality of the Trinity of open source. That platform is something I'll talk about in a little more detail later, because we have the effective utilization of understanding what open source software we need to drive, what open source software we need to utilize, and what needs can only be truly satisfied with a proprietary software development pattern. And so we have to be able to separate and say, what are the software components that are going to be best developed in a community? What are the software components that are going to be best developed with the way a community works? And what are the best software components that need to be developed with a specific customer in mind? And how do we separate those out? One of the main rules that we run into from a community perspective is that communities are very good at building platforms. And those platforms are often nebulous in their capability, and those platforms also create situations where it's easy and viable for large numbers of highly distributed developers to contribute code. When we build platforms like this, they scale much better. There's also another component that's very interesting about community work and open source software. Open source software is generally very good at optionality and flexibility. When you come back and you look at an open source desktop, for instance, you have so many choices as to what desktop you're actually going to run. If you look at a proprietary desktop, almost everybody's Mac and Windows desktops look the same. Sure, you can tweak them and modify them, but you don't turn on a Windows machine and have the question of, well, do you want to install GNOME, KDE, Cinnamon, XFCE, or a myriad of others? That many branching logic is also one of the reasons why community isn't able to dominate certain verticals, and why open source has struggled so much to break into certain aspects of the market. And so that's where the customer needs come into play. Communities want platforms. Communities want code that you can, for the most part, write once and they run well for a long time. But the maintenance of that code is based on refinement rather than ongoing development that just needs to hold it up. Customers need solutions. These are pieces of software that are generally built, again, to an end consumer. It's fairly rare that we run into open source software that is built entirely and driven entirely to satisfy an end consumer. And even then, those open source software components many times struggle to maintain those markets because a consumer customer solution focus is difficult for an open source project to sustain over a long period of time. That is something that a corporate structure is very good at doing. And also, the consumer of this software changes. We end up looking at software that is delivered much more towards your average user. It's meant to solve more human problems than technical problems. Open source software is amazingly effective at solving technical problems. But human problems are things that the vast majority of open source software has struggled to directly solve. Human problems, solutions to specific verticals. These are things that we have to satisfy from a customer perspective. Being able to satisfy these from a customer perspective, again, is where that divide happens. We can look at this example inside of Salt. And this is also one of the reasons why I realized that it would be a really good idea to be acquired by VMware, was that VMware is very good at making solutions that drive specific needs for corporate infrastructure, whereas Salt is a much more open-ended platform. I realized that Salt would be able to drive a lot of additional and new technology inside of VMware and be a powerful tool to create gravity towards VMware products. And that I would be able to create a healthy, symbiotic relationship between open source software and proprietary software inside of VMware. And that's definitely what we've seen over the last year. And so if I rehash really quickly, you must have a high-level objective. Then you need to understand how to address fundamental platform and technical needs, and that these are solved best with a community approach and an open source approach. You need to understand that that open source approach creates gravity towards your utilization of software because it's easy for technical people to come on board. And finally, understanding that there are certain pieces of software that open source has not been able to address. And I don't think that that is a failing of open source, but that is much more a manifestation of how open source software works and is developed. And so, like I was saying before, Android is an amazing example of this. Google actually has a lot of open source projects that are an amazing example of this. Because with Android, you're able to see the leverage of the Linux kernel, much of the open source tool chain, and a significant amount of open source platform software, including the foundation of the UI that's delivered. But we see that phone manufacturers almost universally create targeted, specific proprietary software which drives value to their specific consumers, which is why we see significant refinements or additions, or some may call it bloatware, inside of a lot of Android phones. If I'm completely honest, what Apple has done is also a great example here. Android's an example where we've had a much heavier lean towards open source than Apple, but Apple still develops significant amounts of open source. The Darwin kernel, for instance, was originally derived from the Mach 4 microkernel, developed right here at the University of Utah. And they still followed patterns and paradigms that are used inside of open source Unix style platforms. Apple's many of those core components are open source. Apple then utilized the tool chain, open source tool chains from BSD and Debian to create their platform. But they created more proprietary software in their overall stack than Google chose to. But both of them were able to utilize open source, utilize community in different ways, and satisfy the needs of a community in different ways. So they executed against what I would argue is the Trinity of open source, even though they did it by putting more weight in different parts of the triangle. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the journey of open source applies to everyone involved. All product monetization is moving towards needing to embrace this balance to a certain extent. You cannot simply wake up and make proprietary software and sell it based on the fact that it is proprietary software. It must address the larger needs of teams and groups that are utilizing that software and that are solving those specific needs. Even if you are creating software which is very high level, that is targeted towards users which are very distant from the technical needs of an open source platform, you still have to understand and incorporate those aspects of open source community. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to deliver that software because you must rely on open source components. And so subsequently, you have to understand how to incorporate those open source components, how to support and interact with those open source communities, and which components are given what value inside of your overall tool chain, and how you want to interact and utilize them. But that also means that we have to embrace something that, if I'm honest, I feel we've tried really hard to avoid over the years. And that is accepting the liabilities of open source. So if I'm perfectly honest, there are a lot of liabilities to utilizing open source. Now, I feel that the benefits dramatically outweigh the liabilities. But if we don't clearly understand what those liabilities are, then we can't make educated decisions about how much weight we need our overall strategy to give to open source and to the consumer component, as well as driving those high-level objectives. If we're able to understand that balance, it becomes much easier to make the right decisions about how we interact with open source, how we utilize open source, and how all of it needs to be brought together in a way that gives us really good strategic balance and gets us to where we want to be. And so we have to understand the liabilities of open source. So, understanding those liabilities, there's a number of them that need to be brought to the surface. There are a lot of license liabilities with open source. This is generally where people stop thinking about the liabilities of open source. They look at it and they say, well, is it a GPL style license, or is it a more Apache or MIT style license? Are we looking at an open source license that's going to mandate that if I link to this code, I have to open source the code that links to it? Or am I looking at a license that looks like BSD, where they say, well, you got to write down that you use this software, but that's it. And again, that's where the vast majority of emphasis seems to lie. But we have to be more serious about the overall view of adopting open source software. And so when we come back and we say license liabilities, sure, I think that concept has more or less been beaten to death over the years. What's much more important is that we have to understand who is maintaining that open source software. Why are they maintaining that open source software? How many people are maintaining it? What is the overall bus factor of that software? I was quite happy a few years ago. Google went through and built a tool that determined what the liability of open source projects was. Google went through and said, how many of these open source projects are being maintained by one person that are incredibly critical to large scale infrastructure? This project concluded for Salt, which made me pretty darn excited, that not only is Salt the most critical Python project developed today when it comes to overall utilization, it was literally at the top of the Python list. Huge compliment. I was very excited. And so I immediately went to Dirk Honda, the head of the Office of Open Source, because this happened, I think I said years ago, but no, this happened right after the acquisition, so less than a year ago. This last year obviously seems like it's been many years. I think many of us feel that way. So I went to Dirk and I said, oh, I'm excited about this. He laughed and said, well, do you feel the pressure now? And I was able to smile and respond with, oh no, something that Google put out a little before that shows that Salt is an extremely healthy project, that it has a lot of people working on it and a lot of people continuously touching large amounts of the code base. So there are very few pieces of the code base which only a handful of people know. And we used to make jokes a few years ago about if you wanted to add a requisite to Salt, the way to do it was to ask Tom to add the requisite. I don't think that's the case anymore. Enough people understand how the state system works, that it can be extended in a clean way. And so understanding what the development liability of the open source project you want to leverage is critical to choosing that open source project as something that your corporation or organization is going to rely on. I was, to be honest, terrified when I learned that large-scale infrastructures were using Salt when it was only 3 or 4 months old. One of the largest social networks in the world had started to rely on Salt to manage over 5,000 nodes, when Salt was a mere infant in its evolution. Later, I went to a meetup at this company years later, and they're going over how their infrastructure worked. And I said, why aren't you using states to do this work? And they laughed and said, well, Salt states didn't exist when we started utilizing Salt. I was gobsmacked to think that they had made a decision of that scale in what I thought was a rather high-risk scenario. Now, with that said, it is acceptable to take high-level risks as long as you understand them and understand that you can't do that all the time. It's extremely reckless to say, I'm going to build a complicated system and choose only open source components that are extremely young and very dangerous to use. Whereas it is a good idea to pick the occasional high risk component and utilize that high risk component. You've got to understand the delivery chain. How are you getting that software? You need to understand what level of participation you are going to have to engage in that upstream software based on your utilization. Understanding that level of upstream participation is critical and crucial. This is also something that I've tried to do with the engineering of Salt, so that it's easy for an organization to utilize a broad, powerful platform, but also be able to have targeted and very tactical upstream contributions, so that the vast majority of the surface area that a user of that software and a contributor of that software needs to interact with is pluggable. Making that surface area pluggable and compartmentalized means that you lower the amount of liability that your users have to accept. When you lower the liability that your users have to accept as an open source software developer, that means that you create software that is significantly easier to be adopted in a larger, more strategic sphere. When you create software that is static and tightly coupled, then that software is much more difficult for your end users to adopt. Now, let me talk about a few of these things in a little more detail. When you bring open source software into a software project, which is which is universal, you are relying on code that you don't control and that you don't necessarily maintain. That means that you have to calculate the liability associated with it. Because if you are delivering a proprietary piece of software that relies on open source code, then the management of that open source code is a long-term liability you have accepted. The buck stops with you, the person who is delivering. Every open source license is written in such a way that says that if this doesn't do what you think it's going to do in the long run, it's not my problem. Because obviously, if you're giving something away for free, you can't assume the liability of that code. You do not have the economic incentive to maintain that liability. And so when somebody utilizes open source software, they have to accept that liability to a certain extent. This is one of the reasons why it's wise to choose open source software projects that have strong backing from large corporations, that have large development teams and healthy communities. And so making those decisions means that it lowers the amount of liability that you, the user, are taking upon yourself. Next, you need to understand the delivery chain. I am amazed at how few people don't seem to care about the delivery chain. I'll admit that in the early days of Salt, I was often annoyed by people who cared a lot about the delivery chain. But as I look back, refining that delivery chain has been one of the smartest things that we've done. But it's also something that is more neglected now than I think I've ever seen in the history of open source. The vast majority of open source software projects and software deliverables don't mandate signed software deliverables. It's extremely easy for supply chain attacks to be instigated, and supply chain attacks are extremely common. We also need to understand how code is being delivered into the project. Because if we have a high contribution rate, then that can raise the amount of code liabilities that can come in. That also means that if we have extremely complex software, which is not properly compartmentalized, then it's easier for potential negative actors to be able to inject malicious code. I should be, I'm hesitant to say this. I've talked about this a little bit on the hacks, but there are government agencies, oftentimes not the United States government, many international government agencies that have purposefully sought to plant malicious code for their own purposes inside of open source software projects. Understanding how this works and how that code is being reviewed is an important factor for how these tool chains need to be delivered. And understanding that that there are bad actors out there who want to do supply chain attacks. Everything from delivering malicious code inside of pull requests, all the way to being able to do man-in-the-middle attacks with code delivery mechanisms. Understanding that tool chain, again, is critical, that you're able to deliver software that you can rely on. One of the best examples of this recently was a university. I don't remember for sure the university all of a sudden, but a university did a research paper to see how difficult it would be to implant malicious code into the Linux kernel. This created an uproar in the Linux community when they found out. But at the same time, it definitely issued a concern that is very real. We need to be able to understand that delivery chain when we have so many people from disparate locations contributing code. We should know who that person is that we're getting code from. We should know whether or not we can trust that person and that group. And we should know where the buck stops so that when malicious code is found, that we can point back to its source and that we can learn from our mistakes as to how that code was added. Next, I'm going to talk about the fact that there are some open source projects that you want to drive. And there are some open source projects, the majority, that you want to use. Again, a lot of people look at open source from a purely benevolent perspective, thinking, oh, it's benevolent and good that we're developing open source software. But the reality is that we shouldn't look at the world in such a black and white way. The world is gray. And so when we look at open source software development, it's important to be able to understand that open source software development needs to be a part of your long-term strategy. How much weight are you giving that side of the triangle? And sometimes you pick open source projects that you want to be heavily involved in, that the direction of that open source project, the code and the maintenance of that open source project is critical to what you do. And that is measuring not only the direction of the project, but also the overall liability that it presents. There are many projects that should probably be driven by many large corporate sponsors that are not, because these corporate sponsors don't understand the overall liability that's coming into those projects. But VMware's support of the SALT project, for instance, is a very good example of this. VMware wants to be in a position where it can have a heavy reliance on SALT, and therefore they understand the value of being able, the value that they derive from putting an extremely large investment into the SALT project. There are also, and this is the way most open source projects are, but there are also projects that you use. I love this quote from Linus, where he says, I do not see open source as some big goody, let's all sing kumbaya around the campfire and make the world a better place. No, open source only really works if everybody is contributing for their own selfish reasons. If you want to contribute to an open source project for not selfish reasons, because you feel you are being goody good, I'm actually going to argue that that's a terrible reason to contribute to open source, because it is not sustainable. You must understand that the economics of your decisions need to be sustained. And so being able to look at an open source project and say, I'm going to choose this open source project as a component that is less critical to my overall strategy, but needs to be utilized, then clearly I should choose an open source project that will not likely require heavy investment, and that the risk is low. That's usually choosing more established open source projects, larger communities, and maybe concepts that are a little older. And then coming back and saying, this is something that is critical to my strategy and is going to give me long-term benefit. Therefore, that's a project I want to be more heavily involved in. I want to be a driving factor in that project. So that you understand that your reliance on those projects is directly related to your overall strategic vision, needs, and utilizations for those projects. And so I'm going to wrap up by just going over, once again, the open source trinity. That we have to have a clear view of our long-term strategic objective. This is so difficult for so many people to do. We have to accept the fact that there is always, in the modern world, a community engagement. Otherwise, you just don't have access to the software you need to deliver. And that when we're delivering software, it is universally trying to solve a consumer style need. And that consumer need is where monetization is derived. That consumer need is directly how you make money with software, all software, open source and proprietary. And that consumer solution orient is the focal point of your economic driving factors. But again, you can't get to those economic driving factors. You can't deliver that software in the modern world without having a strong understanding of that community engagement. And so I'm all wrapped up. That's my spiel. Does anyone have any comments, questions, arguments, or rebuttals?
So, Tom, I looked in the Q&A tab. There's nothing over there. So if anybody wants to ask a question either in the chat or in the Q&A, you're welcome to. If you would like to hop on screen and you can request to share your camera and microphone, and I'll let you in and we can talk, and you can ask your question verbally as well. There's a question about the presentation. Are the presentations going to be available after SaltConf, or will they be available in Hopin?
Yes. So as with every year, all of the SaltConf presentations are going to be made available after the conference. We love making them available after the conference, and to be honest, this is one of the best ways that we have to generate a lot of content for consumption and just to help bring people into the project. We're really grateful for everyone's engagement as they've helped us create all of this content in these presentations and helped us create what is turning out to be yet another phenomenal SaltConf.
I want to, Tom, I want to point out that I noticed with all of your graphics and pictures and pop culture references that you did a fantastic job of acknowledging your sources, which would be a great example of how we use open source software as well, where we acknowledge our sources and attribute them in the credits of our software.
I appreciate that. That's also something that VMware's mandated.
Yeah, in today's world, it's an important thing to do.
So another question popped up that says that I have sessions that are opposite everybody. We made the decision about a month ago that if I took on, so originally I was given like 2 presentations, and we made the decision that, okay, if I took on just 2 or 3 more, then we could make an additional track. And so I said, sure, why not? And as time went on, we actually had a couple of cancellations at the last minute, and I had to take on like 2 more talks to maintain the extra track. So yes, I do have a talk opposite to almost everyone, but you will have access to all of these presentations after the fact.
Okay. If there are no more questions, then what we'll do is we'll be respectful of everyone's time, let everyone have a chance to take a break, go get something to eat or drink, or take whatever break you need. And let's see, it looks like this comment is ending with a question. Looking at fruit, one of the current challenges of open source ecosystems, which do you think actually is the most pressing today? Tom, last question, and then we'll wrap that up from Cody there.
I think that the most pressing open source question today, that's an incredibly difficult question because there's a lot of different veins that we have to deal with. I think that how we fund open source moving forward is one of the biggest questions that we should be asking. I think that Docker as a corporation is a really good example of how you can have significant open source investments into a company like Docker that can go completely sideways. And my argument is that Docker as a company went full on the community side of the triangle. They weren't able to codify a long-term objective, and they weren't able to understand what their customer deliverable was going to be in a way that was sufficient to driving long-term revenue. And they didn't understand that when you tackle your customer need, it has to be outside of the scope of what is generally satisfied with open source development. Their attempt was inside of the open source development scope. And that is why if we go back to 2015, 2016, I had investors calling me and saying, should I invest in Docker? And I said, no. And they said, you're insane. Everybody's putting money in this. And I said, no, don't touch Docker. Don't put money in there. Yes, it's going to win technically, but it's not going to win economically. And that is what happened. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we have today. Is there too much choice in open source software? Yep, and there always will be.
All right, folks, we do need to wrap it up. Thank you all for the questions. Thank you, Tom, for an excellent presentation. We look forward to hearing more from you. Everybody, welcome to SaltConf. Have a great day today and tomorrow. We'll go ahead and wrap this up so that everyone has a chance to take a break before they head into their next session. Thank you all.